Imagine living in your own home, but describing it on an internet forum as living with an unpinned grenade.
Oh, wow. That is a heavy description.
Right. But that is the exact phrase a modern owner used in our sources today to describe living with the ultimate global symbol of dog loyalty, the Akita Inu. Because, when you stop someone on the street and ask about this breed, you definitely don't hear about grenades, you hear about Hachiko.
Right, the quintessential tearjerker story.
Exactly.
The fluffy, completely devoted mascot waiting at the train station through snow and rain until the end of time. I mean, it is literally the gold standard of man's best friend.
It really is. And yet, diving into the massive stack of research we have for today's deep dive, which is everything from translated official Japanese breed standards to modern behavioral science and these desperate Reddit forums, that Hollywood image completely shatters.
Yeah, it falls apart pretty quickly.
You read the posts from these everyday owners, and there's just a palpable sense of fear, profound frustration, and even, honestly, a feeling of betrayal. They're terrified of their own dogs.
Which is exactly why our mission today is to completely deconstruct that complex psyche.
Let's do it.
But to do that, we have to establish a hard rule for anyone listening. If you want to understand the Akita, you must wipe your mental slate clean.
Right.
Start projecting human emotions onto them, and stop treating them like a golden retriever wearing a thicker coat. You are dealing with a highly specialized, ancient predator.
So let's follow that evolutionary thread, because the sources make it explicitly clear that you just cannot understand the modern Akita walking down a suburban cul-de-sac without looking at the extreme environment that forged its DNA.
Yeah, you really can't.
We are talking about the snowy, completely unforgiving mountains of the Akita Prefecture in Japan.
Right, and the ancestors of this breed, the Matagi Inu, they were hunting dogs. But they weren't, flushing out pheasants or ducks.
Right.
They were tracking Japanese black bears and massive wild boars through snowdrifts that could be several feet deep.
Wow.
And in that environment, the human hunter is miles behind on foot, just slogging through the snow.
So the dog is completely isolated out there. It can't just stop, turn around, and look for a hand signal from its owner.
Exactly. The dog has to do the math itself. I mean, if the Matagi Inu miscalculates the distance or engages a 500-pound bear a fraction of a second too early, it dies.
It's life or death.
Literally.
Yeah.
That environment acted as a ruthless genetic filter. It mapped their brains for total autonomy. They were forced to analyze risk independently, which means they're biologically programmed to think for themselves, not to offer the blind, instant obedience that we bred into modern herding dogs.
So they aren't the soldiers waiting for an order from a general. They are the generals.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And that independence sounds majestic when we talk about a lone hunter in the mountains. But here's where it gets really interesting and honestly kind of dark when we move into the Edo period.
Yeah, this is a massive shift.
Japanese took this agile, independent mountain dog down into the cities and deliberately crossbred it with mastiffs and the Tosa.
Because the goal shifted from hunting to the fighting pit. They wanted to create a massive gladiator dog.
Right.
And the crossbreeding didn't just change the physical architecture of the dog, giving it a heavier skull and a much more devastating bite force. It completely altered their neurochemistry.
They intentionally introduced intraspecies aggression into the gene pool.
Exactly. The survival mechanisms just shifted. The dopamine pathways in the dog's brain were rewired so they would view other dogs not as pack members or playmates, but as immediate mortal threats.
Wow.
That gladiator era left a deep, permanent scar in their DNA.
And their survival story only gets more extreme from there. Fast forward to World War II, and the breed is practically wiped off the map.
Almost entirely gone.
Yeah. The military was confiscating all non-military dogs to use their fur to line the coats of soldiers freezing in Manchuria.
It's awful.
It is. The only reason the Akita exists today is that desperate owners began secretly crossbreeding them with German Shepherds, which were exempt from the cull because of their military status.
And that desperate wartime survival tactic actually created the modern split that we see today between the leaner, sort of fox-like Japanese Akita and the much heavier, thicker American Akita line.
Right, which solidified when Helen Keller brought the very first Akitas over to the United States.
Yes, exactly.
But that historical timeline creates a massive paradox that I want to push back on for a second.
Okay, let's hear it.
You have this brutal gladiator machine, forged in a fighting pit, with heavy intraspecies aggression. Yet, our sources highlight a 10th century decree from a shogun legally requiring Japanese citizens to address these dogs as Oinu-sama, meaning Mr. Dog or Mrs. Dog.
Yeah, they were revered.
Highly revered, like a natural monument.
Mhm.
How did a literal arena killer earn that level of profound cultural reverence?
Well, the paradox really only exists in our Western understanding of dogs.
Mm.
To the Japanese at the time, the Akita was the ultimate embodiment of the samurai ideal.
Yeah.
Right. The lethal, terrifying physical capability wasn't viewed as a negative, provided it was anchored by an absolute stoic calm. A true warrior never wastes energy.
They don't throw tantrums.
Exactly. They are composed, perfectly still, but capable of devastating force the very moment a line is crossed.
And that perfectly explains the modern Japanese breed standards from Nippo, the organization preserving these native breeds. Because they don't judge the dog on the exact angle of its ears or the color of its coat.
No, it's all about character.
They judge the mental architecture through three specific pillars. First is Kan, which translates to cold courage and dignity.
This is why an Akita is never hysterical. I mean, if a leaf falls from a tree, a terrier barks at it. A spaniel might jump.
Right.
An Akita simply watches it fall. They refuse to thrash on a leash over trivial things because their baseline is profound dignity.
But Kan on its own sounds like a recipe for a Terminator.
Yeah.
Cold courage needs a counterbalance, which is the second pillar, Ryose.
Yes. Crucial
Yeah.
piece.
This translates to a gentle nature and deep loyalty to their pack. And the behavioral analysts and the sources essentially say that without Ryose, the Akita would just be a sociopath.
That's entirely accurate.
It's the familial bond that acts as the safety switch on that terrifying physical power.
And tying it all together is the third pillar, soboku, which means rustic simplicity or absolute authenticity.
Meaning they don't fake anything?
Exactly. If an Akita doesn't respect you, it won't pretend to like you for a piece of cheese. They never fawn over a stranger just to get attention.
And this authenticity is exactly where modern owners hit a massive wall. The forums are filled with people throwing around the word stubborn.
Oh, constantly.
They say the dogs groom themselves like cats, they were aloof, and they outright refuse basic obedience training.
But calling an Akita stubborn is really a failure to understand their intelligence. You have to remember the autonomy we talked about with the Matagi Inu in the mountains.
Right. And I actually came up with an analogy while reading the research to explain this dynamic.
Oh, I love your analogies. Let's hear it.
Training an Akita feels like hiring a brilliant, highly paid corporate consultant.
Okay.
If you give this consultant a complex, high-stakes problem, they will execute it flawlessly. But if you pay that same consultant to pick up a heavy binder, move it to the other side of the desk, and then move it back, and you demand they do it 10 times in a row for no logical reason, that consultant is going to look at you with utter pity, fold their arms, and completely refuse to work.
That is the exact mechanism at play.
Yep.
And Akita's brain is constantly running a rigorous cost-benefit analysis.
Always crunching the numbers.
Yes. When you force mindless repetition in a sterile living room, sit, stand, the dog processes that command and sees absolutely zero survival value.
Zero.
And furthermore, the dog decides that you are an incompetent leader for demanding something so utterly pointless. The moment you lose their respect, the guardrails come off.
And when Akita stops respecting you, that's when you start seeing those terrifying Reddit posts where owners claim the dog attacked entirely unprovoked, without any warning.
Yeah, but the scientific consensus on the unprovoked attack is very clear. It is a complete myth.
The warnings are always there.
Always. The humans are simply failing to read them.
Because we expect dogs to communicate like Labradors. But going back to the snow and the bears, a dog that barks loudly and snarls at a bear just alerts the bear, gets itself killed, and gets the hunter killed.
Exactly. The Akita evolved to communicate its displeasure silently.
Right.
The window between an Akita feeling threatened and launching a physical strike is terrifyingly brief. We're talking often just 2 seconds, and the microsignals they give off in that window are incredibly subtle.
Let's break those down, starting with the tail trap. Because this gets so many people bitten. We're conditioned to think a wagging tail equals a happy dog.
Which is a dangerous assumption with primitive breeds.
Right. But the sources point out that when an Akita's tail goes incredibly stiff, arches high over the back, and starts vibrating rapidly, that is not joy. That is an extreme tension warning flag. It means the dog is locked and loaded.
Yeah, and following the tail trap, you often see a biological mechanism called apnea.
Where they stop breathing.
Yes.
Yeah.
The dog completely freezes and literally holds its breath. This isn't just about being perfectly still either. Holding their breath stabilizes their core and primes their fast twitch muscles for an explosive, sudden strike.
Wow. And the facial cues match that predatory lockdown, too. The sources describe whale eye, where the dog tilts its head down and you see the whites of its eyes.
The mechanics of whale eye are fascinating. The dog is rigidly fixating its skull, basically keeping its snout pointed forward to protect its neck, while using only the movement of its eyes to track a target in its peripheral vision.
It minimizes the dog's movement.
Exactly, making it much harder for the target to read their intent. You also see the whiskers point sharply forward and the commissures, which are the corners of the mouth, get incredibly tense.
2 seconds of that, and then the bite happens.
Yeah.
And if human instinct is to, reach out and pet a dog to calm them down when they seem tense, doing that during a microsignal must be the absolute worst thing you can do.
It guarantees a bite. Reaching into the physical space of a primitive dog experiencing apnea is interpreted by the dog as a direct physical challenge.
This completely upends traditional dog training advice, especially regarding vocalization, because society tells us that if the dog growls, it's being dominant, and we must punish it to show who is alpha.
Right, the old dominance myth.
But punishing an Akita for growling is like taking the batteries out of your smoke detector because the high-pitched beeping is annoying you. You didn't put out the fire in your kitchen. You literally just disabled your early warning system.
That is a critical point. If you punish an Akita for vocalizing, even just a low rumble or a sharp huff of air, that highly analytical brain immediately updates its cost-benefit analysis.
Right.
The dog learns, communicating my discomfort brings a physical penalty from my owner. Next time, I will skip the warning and just bite. You are actively building the unpinned grenade.
So what is the actual solution when you see these microsignals?
You have to step back and allow the dog to use natural calming signals. Things like a massive exaggerated yawn or intensely licking their own nose.
I've seen that. It looks like they're just bored.
Right, but these aren't signs of boredom. They are biological mechanisms the dog uses to forcefully lower its own heart rate and decompress. You have to give them the physical space to execute those signals.
And reading these signals becomes a matter of life and death when it collides with the breed's genetics as they mature. The forums are filled with the exact same tragic narrative.
It's so common.
Someone gets a fluffy Akita puppy. It plays nicely at the dog park with the golden retrievers for a year. Then, right around the 2 to 3 year mark, a switch flips in the dog's brain and it turns into a monster, actively trying to attack every dog of the same sex walking down the street.
This is known in behavioral circles as same-sex aggression, or SSA. This is that Edo period gladiator DNA waking up.
Just turning back on.
Exactly. It lies dormant during puppyhood, but when the dog reaches full social and sexual maturity, usually between 24 and 36 months, that old genetic programming basically takes the wheel.
Okay, let me play the eternal optimist here for a second.
Sure.
Because you hear it all the time. There are no bad dogs, only bad owners. It's all how you raise them. Can't a loving home, tons of early socialization, and high-quality treats just erase this SSA?
Biology is entirely unsentimental. No amount of love can erase hundreds of years of deliberate genetics selection.
Wow.
Thinking you can socialize the genetics out of an Akita is a dangerous fantasy. Owners really must understand the crucial difference between curing a behavior and managing it.
Right.
You cannot cure SSA in a mature Akita. Throwing a 3-year-old Akita into a crowded dog park and hoping they, work it out is pure negligence.
So management is the only path forward.
Yep.
And the sources outline specific non-force strategies to handle this. The first is the STAP protocol for encountering a trigger on a walk.
Which is fantastic.
S is for stop and take a breath. The sources specifically note that if the owner panics and yanks the leash tight, that tension travels right down the nylon.
Yes. And a tight leash physically restricts the dog's movement, completely mimicking the pre-strike posture we discussed earlier.
Oh, that makes sense.
Through proprioception, the dog feels your panic, assumes the strange dog approaching is the cause of that panic, and prepares to defend you both.
The O is observe the distance between you and the trigger.
Yeah.
And P is proceed safely in a wide arc, never walking in a straight head-on line, which dogs naturally view as a confrontation.
Exactly.
But the most impressive tool in the research is the LA method, which stands for, look at that.
LAT is arguably the most powerful tool for primitive breeds because it fundamentally rewires the neurology of the dog. It's counter-conditioning.
How does the actual mechanism of LAT work?
Well, normally, when a mature Akita sees a strange dog down the block, their amygdala triggers a massive spike in cortisol. They enter an uncontrollable fight-or-flight state. LA intervenes before that spike happens. The moment the dog sees the trigger, before they react, they are conditioned to immediately turn their head and look back at the owner for a high-value reward.
But I imagine distance is the key factor here. If the strange dog is 5 feet away, the Akita is already way over threshold, right?
Exactly. If you are too close, the cortisol flood has already breached the brain's reasoning center. LAT only works if you start at a distance where the dog can see the trigger but hasn't reacted yet, say 50 feet away.
Right, far enough to feel safe.
Over months of repetition, the sight of another dog stops being an alarm bell demanding a fight. The neural pathway is literally rewired, so the trigger becomes a signal that a massive dopamine hit a payday is coming from the owner.
The trigger literally changes from a threat into a paycheck.
Perfectly said.
But to successfully execute that kind of psychological rewiring, the owner has to be incredibly tuned in, especially during the dog's developmental stages. The sources describe the 8-month mark as the ghost phase, and it sounds like an absolute war zone.
Canine adolescence is notoriously difficult for any breed, but for an Akita, it is completely magnified.
You have a puppy that has been perfectly trained for months, and suddenly they wake up one morning and start viciously barking at the plastic trash can in your driveway that has been there every single day of their life.
Yeah, it's wild.
What is happening in their brain?
It is a massive biological event. The brain is undergoing synaptic pruning, literally shedding unused neural pathways while simultaneously flooding the system with new sex hormones.
Oh, wow.
It's like trying to install a massive operating system update on your computer while you are actively trying to type on it. The drivers crash, the screen freezes, the dog's amygdala is overreacting to novelty, causing them to be genuinely terrified of their own internal sensory overload. Familiar objects suddenly look completely alien.
So if my 8-month-old Akita is terrified and acting aggressively toward a trash can, instinct might tell some people to use old-school dominance training. Alpha roll the dog, pin them to the pavement, and physically dominate them to prove who is in charge.
Implementing physical violence during the ghost phase is the fastest way to ruin an Akita forever.
Because of the Ryosei, that bond we talked about.
Yes, exactly. You completely destroy that foundational trust. The dog's brain is already screaming that the world is unpredictable and dangerous.
Right.
If the person who provides their food and shelter suddenly attacks them, they learn that you are not a safe harbor. You become just another unpredictable threat to manage. You will create fear-based aggression that cannot be untrained.
You have to be a stoic oasis of calm. You hold the boundary without escalating the violence. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. True socialization.
Right.
Because modern pet culture tells us to drag our puppies everywhere. Weekend farmers markets, outdoor cafes, letting a dozen strangers pet them all at once.
Dragging an Akita into a chaotic crowd to be mauled by strangers is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
These dogs are genetic introverts. They were not engineered to be the star attraction of a petting zoo.
The sources outline a completely different approach called the art of resignation. True socialization for an Akita isn't about interaction. It's about neutrality.
Yes.
You keep them at a safe, comfortable distance from the chaos, and you reward them heavily simply for ignoring it.
They need to learn how to be indifferent observers. They need to understand that the chaotic world exists, but they are not required to manage or police it. They need to trust that their stoic, capable owner is handling the environment for them.
Synthesizing everything we've pulled from these sources today, from the Matagi Inu calculating risk in the snow, to the neurochemistry of the Ito fighting pits, the silent 2-second warnings, and the reality of the ghost phase raising an Akita, really isn't about training in the human sense. It's an ongoing negotiation.
It really is.
You are building an alliance based on deep mutual respect for an evolutionary marvel.
It is a profound partnership. Dictatorships just do not work with primitive predators.
And understanding this psychology holds immense value for you, the listener, regardless of whether you ever plan on bringing an Akita into your home. By shedding the deeply ingrained habit of anthropomorphizing animals, by refusing to project human spite, stubbornness, or guilt onto a dog, you'll instantly become fluent in a new language.
Absolutely.
When you learn to spot the stiff tail, the frozen breath of apnea, the whale eye, you will be able to read the microsignals of every single dog you walk past on the street.
It forces you to stop demanding they speak our language and allows you to finally listen to theirs.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over.
When we look at the totality of what the Akita is, a proud, ancient, fiercely independent hunter forged by freezing snow, wild bears, and the brutal reality of combat, what does it actually say about us?
Yep.
What does it reveal about humanity's desperate need to conquer and tame the natural world? That we try to force this majestic, specialized predator into the center of our manicured suburbs, and then have the audacity to become angry when it refuses to play the role of an eternally grateful, crowd-loving plush toy.
Ponder that dynamic the next time you see a dog waiting faithfully by a train station or pulling hard on a leash in your neighborhood. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.